Welcome to What Pain Teaches Us, Jewish Lessons on Healing with the Wisdom Center for Open Learning at the American Jewish University. Whether it's your first time with us or the 20th, I'm so glad that you're here today for this meaningful conversation about how Jewish wisdom can help us navigate pain and healing. We're joined today by Rabbi Ilana Grinblat, who is the rabbi of Ahavat Torah in Los Angeles and of Temple Har Shalom in Idyllwild, California. She's the author of a number of books, including The Viral Spread of Hope, Finding Inspiration in Tough Times, Castles and Catch, Spiritual Lessons Our Children Teach Us, and Blessings and Baby Steps, The Spiritual Path of Parenthood. She was awarded an honorary doctorate of divinity from the American Jewish University, where she was ordained in 2001. She and her husband are blessed to be the parents of 2 children, and I have had the good fortune of teaching alongside Rabbi Grinblat at the American Jewish University at the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies. Welcome, Rabbi Grinblat.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for being here again and for sharing this book with us. So I want to start us off. Some of the people here may have read the book and some people might not have. So I want to ask you if you could start by giving us an overview of the experience that you chronicle in your book.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and for this conversation. So the book is a memoir about a more than 2-year journey, which is mostly about, I had a medical procedure in December of 2021 that went awry and left me in tremendous pain and not knowing why or what the solution would be. The book actually starts 3 weeks before the procedure. It actually starts with the suicide of a close friend of my children and of my family, who was 16 and a half years old. And the moment of that suicide and the burial was really a spiritual and emotional low point for me. I had been in the pandemic and as we all were, and in a position of dealing with the emergencies. I was working at the Board of Rabbis at the time, so I had been dealing for several years with the emergencies related to the pandemic. And that suicide was a really painful moment. Was the child of an extremely close friend of mine who was friends with my children. And so it was extremely painful moment. And then 3 weeks later, I had gone to my regular checkup, and I had been told that a polyp needed to be removed from my cervix to make sure that it wasn't cancer. So I had it removed, and it wasn't cancer, thankfully. But the procedure went awry. It was supposed to be a minor procedure. You're a little sore the next day, and that's it. But the next day, I was in so much pain that I was in the hospital. And my doctor couldn't figure out why I was having that reaction to that procedure. I couldn't sit down and was in constant pain. And so for 5 months, I was getting treatments that were incorrect and trying through a process of elimination to figure out what had happened and why. And then eventually came to a different theory as to what had happened and went through treatments for that. And the process as a whole took over 2 years and led me through Western medicine, and then when that didn't succeed, to Eastern medicine, and a whole different bunch of healing modalities. If it exists, I tried it to see see what I could do. Um, uh, as a result, it led me on a journey which was both emotional and spiritual and physical. And since I'm a rabbi and I view the world through the lens of Jewish text and Jewish tradition, that also informed my spiritual journey along the way. So I ended up writing this experience and lessons that came through it about healing and about life.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So you detail your journey through these deeply personal matters, right? You talk about this emotional, spiritual pain that you experienced, certainly the experience of, the child of a close friend and their death by suicide, right? And the physical pain that you endured for a number of years. And so can you elaborate kind of, I want to, see if you can speak to like your decision to write this book, right? To chronicle that for yourself is one thing, but really it's another decision to share that experience with the world. And I'm curious about, did you have any doubts or concerns about sharing the nature of your condition so publicly, right? Because we're talking about pelvic pain, right? This is not in the usual gamut of things that are often in the kind of public discourse. And so, you know, did you kind of hesitate about that? And maybe to what extent did your position as a rabbi affect your decision to share the experience, either by making you more reluctant or more kind of motivated to share that?
Sure, thank you. So the impetus to start writing and chronicling the journey came and to the end of hoping to put it out into the world came to me about 6 months into the journey. I went on a conference about pelvic pain with a doctor in Northern California who himself had experienced pelvic pain for 20 years. He couldn't sit down for 20 years, and he invented a device with which to cure himself. And then as a result, and a methodology, not only a device, but a whole program with which to cure himself. And then once he cured himself, he does these monthly workshops. And so I went to one of those workshops, which had about 6 other patients in it from all over the world. And it was at that workshop that the idea came to me of writing this. Speaking to the other people in the workshop, there was so much pain around this topic that, I had been enduring the pain at that point for 6 months, but I was the one who had been enduring it the least amount of time. Most of the other people at the conference had been enduring it for decades, some for their entire adult lives. And there was so much secrecy around it and not a lot of information around it. And the center that I went to puts out extraordinary writing on the topic, but which was inspiring to me, but they didn't have a memoir about the experience. And I was realizing that by listening to the stories of the other patients, I was learning so much that I thought perhaps I could pay that forward by sharing my own experiences. So I was writing as I was going along through this journey. The decision to put it out publicly, there was a hesitation on my part. Partially, there are a lot of people in the book, my healers, my children, my family, and friends, and the process of checking every quote with every person and making sure that they were comfortable with the way that they were being featured. And I did need to change some names to preserve people's anonymity. So that piece of it, was extensive, and there was a great deal of reflection on my part in terms of how much to reveal and whether to put it out in the world. Certainly as rabbis, at least in my generation, we weren't taught to share these kinds of things.
Mhm. Mhm.
Talking about one's cervix is not normally something you do as a rabbi. There was a period of deliberation on my part, and there was a time that I wasn't sure whether I would put it out into the world. But I am glad that I made that decision. I've been able to hear back from people facing a range of different points in their life,
Mhm.
found it beneficial. So I'm grateful to be able to share the story.
Yeah, and we're grateful to you for sharing it. Um, so, you talked about how, you went through this experience, and as a rabbi, you go through life in a particular way. And, you know, um, the Jewish people have endured a lot, right? Historically and in the present, exile, destruction, persecution, suffering, right? We continue to experience that very deeply, in current times as well, unfortunately. And, as such, like our tradition grapples with how to understand and confront the experience of suffering. So, I'm curious if you can speak to how you made sense of your own experience of suffering. Did that affect or change your faith or your relationship with God? Or, how did you digest, right? Like, you have a particular outlook, and then how did that outlook kind of inform the ways in which you experienced that or reconciled that?
Yeah, so as a rabbi, I certainly, and as a, involved Jewish learner, I see the world through the prism of Jewish text. And so Jewish texts were helpful to me throughout the journey. I had to, as part of my treatment, swim every morning. And I would, as I was swimming, recite, you know, several verses, one from the Psalms that says, you know, I've mina metzar karati ava anani b'merchavya. I've called out to
Mm,
you from a narrow place, and you've answered me with wide open spaces. And
mhm,
also Moses's prayer for his sister Miriam, Al Narafanala, God heal her.
mhm,
I would recite that in my head as I swam. Um,
mm,
and so Jewish, and the chapters throughout are filled with Jewish text. And so that became was a source of strength for me and a source of grappling with
mhm,
my experiences. I, you know, I'm the daughter of a Holocaust scholar.
yeah.
I grew up with the Rabbi Michael Birnbaum. I grew up with the Holocaust Museum in Washington. He began that project when I was 7 years old, and it opened when I was 22. So the museum and I grew up together.
Mhm,
I was there from when it was an idea that he used to draw on a paper to when we had architectural plans to the groundbreaking to the opening, and every step in between. And so I'm well acquainted,
mhm,
overly well acquainted with Jewish suffering. Um, and therefore, um, my relationship with God, was built on the foundation of knowing that God doesn't actively prevent harm,
mhm,
but believing
mhm,
in God as a catalyst for healing and transformation and hope. And
mhm,
so, my illness, I will say there were pieces that exposed me to new spiritual modalities that I
mhm,
hadn't encountered before. There was a Reiki session that was the most direct experience I've had of the healing power of prayer.
mhm,
Um, so there were spiritual dimensions along the way, and deepening of gratitude for even basic functions, because I'm now sitting down, which I do for 10 months. And if you can't sit down, then you can't ride in a car or drive a car. So I was essentially disabled and homebound for 10 months. And so gratitude for the power of the body to heal and for it to even do the simplest things at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of, it's interesting, right? A lot of times, we're so used to, when we're fortunate enough for people to share experiences of suffering, right? There's a good portion of the journey or the chronicling of that where often, not always, but often where the person who is in the position of suffering kind of has a sort of existential crisis or a crisis of faith, right? Where it's like, why is this happening to me, right? How could God or the world or the universe allow this to happen to me? Or reflections on the dissonance between who the person is in the world and what they, and the fact that nobody deserves to be in pain or suffering of any kind, right? And a lot of books kind of grapple with that, and it's very striking that that isn't part of this book at all. And so I think it's really novel in that way, and and yet, like you mentioned, this and at the same time, like there's a certain thing about, like, this idea of this is happening to me, right? And in the book you talk about a conversation with, I believe, a massage therapist, right? A therapeutic massage therapist that you were working with, who suggested a reframing of your experience, right? And they suggested that you think of this not as something that was happening to you, which, by the way, I want to add, would be a very reasonable thing to do if you are in constant pain and effectively disabled and homebound for long stretches of time, right? But the massage therapist suggested the reframing of thinking about it as something that was happening for you, right? So I'd love to hear about, how do you think about that today? And also, what did you learn about yourself through this experience, right? If this is something that is happening for you, what did you learn about you for whom this was happening?
Yes. So he did say that to me frequently. Every time he said that, there's a part of me that would cringe, and still does, because the idea of this happening for me, absolutely not, and I clear on, I would have preferred not to have written this book, not to have this experience. If there was anything I could have done to undo it at any second, I would have 100%. And yet the reframing of it and thinking about it that way makes me ask the question of what am I learning, and how am I changing, and how am I growing? And it makes me look for that. And it seemed to me very linked to when Abraham, is called by God and told to go on the journey, lech lecha, go forth. The lecha means both to or for. It has that
Yes.
same meaning in the Hebrew. And so the things that happen to us are also for us in some way. And so it makes me look for those things. I will say, on the first part of your question, yes, it was not a theological crisis for me at all. My father frequently quoted, when I was a child, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, who said, nothing should be said about God that cannot be said in front of burning children. And so the idea, that theology has to include the reality of intense and profound suffering my theology was built on that. So, I
Mhm.
never
Yeah.
once asked, why is this happening to me? Or how could this be happening to me? Not for a second.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
and I have seen many, many times that people lose God precisely when they need God the most, because their
Mhm.
theology is built on other foundations that don't account
Mhm.
adequately for suffering. That was not the case for me. Um,
Yeah.
uh, for which I'm grateful. What I learned from it, well, I mean, that's the totality of what the book is an answer to that question. I did learn determination, that I was going to do whatever it took for however long it took, um,
Mhm.
to to do whatever was necessary to get myself out of pain and to fight
Mhm.
life and to fight for the ability to live it, fully and passionately. So I did discover a fire within that wasn't
Mhm.
give up.
Yeah.
Um, and then along the way, I learned a great deal about both Western medicine and Eastern medicine, and about healing in general, about the spirit and the body and how they connect with one another. And at the beginning, I was looking to Western medicine, which ultimately was unable to solve this problem. And then I had to look to Eastern medicine and to a combination thereof of both Eastern
Mhm.
and Western to ultimately solve the problem,
Mhm.
slowly and gradually. And it was a very step-by-step journey. Um,
Mhm.
I also learned about the power of community. I had lived in Jewish community my entire life. And yet there's something different about when you need it, and it comes through for you, in caring for me in the moments that I needed it. And I learned to ask for help. My instinct was to do precisely the opposite. My instinct,
Mhm.
and for the first 5 months, almost no one knew about my condition. Um, my instinct was to just power through. And I
Mhm.
realized that that was not ultimately
Mhm.
going to work,
Not.
and going to be um, a recipe for healing. So I learned a lot about myself, about healing, and about life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, would that those lessons, had come without this experience.
Yeah.
And yet, I think, yeah, I think we often have this idea about ourselves that, we can power through, and we have strength, and we have determination, and we know in theory that community is important and asking for help is important. And, sometimes, yeah, we discover that it's not, we discover that on a different level in moments like these, and we have an appreciation for that. So, um, there's so much wisdom in this book, right? There's the wisdom that you share in terms of your personal reflections, right? And also the wisdom that you gleaned from the people that you were in contact with, the people that you were in community with, the people who visited you. And also, you share a lot of wisdom from our tradition. And so, um, I want to I want to ask, is there, right, there's so many texts here, right? Is there a particular text or a piece of wisdom that stands out, either because it encapsulates your experience or maybe because it guided you through that, right? You spoke about this almost, these are my words, not yours, but almost this mantra that you would have in your mind as you were swimming daily. So, right, is there a text or a piece of wisdom that encapsulates it or that guided you through it, or that you just kept moving away from but coming back to again and again?
Yes. Um, The two verses that I mentioned to you were very key in this, and also in the introduction, I shared a text from the Talmud where there's a rabbi named
Mhm.
Yochanan who goes to visit another rabbi named Rabbi Chia bar Abba, and he asks Rabbi Chia bar Abba, "Are your sufferings dear to you?" And Rabbi
Mhm.
Chia bar Abba says, "No, neither them or their reward." And
Mhm.
then Rabbi Yochanan reaches out his hand and lifts him up. And later, Rabbi Yochanan becomes ill, and someone comes to visit him and asks him those same questions. Are your sufferings dear to you? And he says, no, neither them nor their reward. And they reach out their hand and lift him up. And then the text asks, wait a minute, if Rabbi Yochanan was such a powerful healer, then why couldn't he heal himself? And it
Mhm.
answers, because no one can free themselves from prison.
Mhm.
And I found that very true for my experience. You know, I had been a rabbi for 20 years when this happened, but could not free myself from prison. I was utterly dependent on other people, on my healers, you know, my doctors, my family and friends and community. And, you know, both the idea that my sufferings were not dear to me. I, you know, again, would not have
Mhm.
wanted this, you know, would have stopped it at any point if I could have, and did not want the suffering nor any reward that could come from it. And that I was dependent on other people to pull me out of prison. And each step, you know, it wasn't like someone just reaching out their hand and pulling me, but rather more like being locked in an escape room, and you have to do each puzzle gives you one little key, which gives you the next,
Mhm.
which gives you another little key. And one person will give you one thing that leads you to the next. So, so it was this, you know, long process of slowly emerging, and the idea that we can't let ourselves out of prison. The only thing we can do, and we can't undo the sufferings that we are
Mhm.
experiencing, the only things we can do is share. Here are the keys I found along the way in case they're useful to you. And,
Mhm.
you know, maybe, you know, someone else shares their key, and that's all we can do to pull each other out.
Yeah, no, and that's beautiful, and I think that there's a way in which this book is helpful. Like the keys that this book offers are both relevant, or perhaps they might be helpful within the realm of the medical piece of it, right? Understanding pain, understanding, even if the reader is not sharing the same experience as, right, or doesn't have the same, the nature of their pain or their medical experience is not the same as yours, but sharing different, modalities that one can pursue in hoping to deal with pain, both in Eastern and Western medicine. And also, right, so it offers keys in that way, also keys about being persistent and self-advocating with one's healthcare professionals, etc. And also the keys of Jewish wisdom and what the Jewish tradition might offer to someone, and a framework for that. So I think it's so valuable. Um, I, how, right, you are a rabbi, right, and you had been a rabbi for 20 years and you continue to be a rabbi, and so how has this experience, right, and all of these different keys and all these realizations about yourself and the people around you, how has that affected you as a rabbi, right? How does it change the way that you rabbi today?
It has deepened my rabbinate. I've been teaching a lot of this, you know, I'm teaching a Torah study class. So whenever we encounter, when the Parsha gets to one of the texts in the book, I've been teaching the text itself and whatever interpretations
Mhm.
had inspired me, and then actually the chapter. And there is in the back an index of Torah portions. So you can look
Mhm.
at the week's Torah portion to see what chapter is about that. So I have been teaching it, and also, my congregants know that I went through this. One of my congregations was with me through it. The other one is new, and I started in September, but I published the book just before I got there. So when people are coming to me, they know that I have faced serious illness over a prolonged period. And so when they're coming to me with their illnesses or with their spiritual struggles, they know that I've walked this walk. And many of my congregants are older, and in some sense, I experienced aging because for parts of this, I was walking with a walker. For parts of this, as I said, I was disabled and homebound. And so they know that also I've experienced the struggles of aging in a sense before my time.
Yeah.
So it has deepened my rabbinate to be able to share in such a personal way. I think in the beginning of my rabbinate, 25 years ago now, I was reluctant to share as personally as I do now. We weren't taught to do that. We were taught not to do that.
Sure.
And yet, actually, at that time, I found that my congregants would get it anyway. Even if I tried to share something through the stories of the Torah, they would say, okay, we realized that was about this. So now to be able to share more personally and more honestly about the struggles has deepened my rabbinate and my connections with people.
Yeah. It strikes me that for a book that details really the importance of community, right? The vital part that it played for you throughout this experience. You are now serving as a rabbi for two communities, right? And building community in that way. And I can only imagine that not only has this deepened your relationship to individuals within the community, but that you orient the community and construct the community with perhaps greater intentionality and greater understanding of not just the relationship between yourself and them, but with the individuals within the community with each other as well.
Yes. I do have a deeper appreciation for how we need community, especially in times of crisis, and what community can do in those moments. And, we just came through the fire, so recently, those moments where we have to pull together. And it does mean more to me now than it had before, and I'm able to convey the importance of that in a different way. And I think also, the importance of not pretending that everything's okay when it isn't, which had been my instinct.
Sure.
I think that that's something as a Jewish community, we have these visions of how we think things are supposed to be and how they're supposed to look, and pretending to fit into a certain box or a certain norm or a certain image doesn't always serve us very well. And I think that's the thing we have to grapple with as a community.
Yeah. In the story that you referred to in the Talmud in Brachot, right? In the first instance, Rabbi Yochanan can only pull Rabbi Chia bar Abba out because he was able to be there to behold his pain and ask him the question, right? He needs to be there, and that means that he needs to take the initiative to go visit the sick person, and the sick person has to allow the other people to see them in the reality of their pain or of their suffering. And that's when and that's not the whole thing, right? Like that's where the conversation begins. That's where Rabbi Yochanan can ask Rabbi Chia, are your sufferings dear to you, right? In other words, are you finding meaning in this? Is it serving you in some way? And when he answers and he says, no, there's nothing of use here, then he can be pulled out. But that is a dance that has to happen between the individual and the community or the people that surround them.
And
Right?
Rabbi Chia Bar Abba has to admit that he's not okay, that he wants out, that he, is
Yes.
rejecting
Yeah.
the suffering,
Right.
so there's
Yes.
both sides of that.
For
Yeah.
sure, right? Like, and it's a deeply vulnerable moment. And then I think the second part of the story tells us that vulnerability can't just be for some people and not others, right? Because then it's none other than Rabbi Yochanan, who previously pulls Rabbi Chia out of suffering, who finds himself suffering. And in that moment, it's no longer like, where once you were the one who could pull someone out, but then there's a vulnerability of also, even as you spoke to earlier, as a rabbi, acknowledging and having the willingness and the courage to be vulnerable and to say, like, this is more than what I can bear, and I can't do this by myself. Yeah.
I think it's like the greatest surgeon can't operate on themselves. Likewise, we can be good spiritual leaders to others, but that doesn't mean that we can do it ourselves.
Yeah. So we're going to turn to the Q&A, but last question I want to ask you. So to the reader, to the person who is fortunate enough to pick up this book, right? What do you hope that they take with them?
I hope that some of the keys that I found along the way will unlock something for them. I hope that they'll take a willingness to honestly share their own stories and admit their own vulnerabilities. I hope that they'll look with fresh eyes on the resources that they have in front of them, from our own tradition, from their own, the people who love them, and that, all we can do is help pull each other out. So I hope that it helps somebody in some way.
I love that. Okay, so we have questions in the Q&A. If you have some questions that we haven't addressed or that you're curious about, please be sure to put them in the Q&A. So one of the questions is in terms of how you think about or approach the medical profession today, right? So you talked about pursuing different avenues, both Eastern and Western medicine. And yeah, this whole thing started with, as you said, a botched procedure. And you certainly chronicle the fact that your medical practitioners were just befuddled, right? And then at some point you had the feeling that, people just threw their hands up in the air, and then you were left to try to solve this mystery. But you're a great rabbi, but not a doctor, right? And you did that, right? And you pursued every avenue and whatnot. So now that you've come out the other side, like, how do you think about and how do you engage with the medical profession?
Yeah. So I think there are several pieces in that. I mean, first of all, I feel tremendous respect for healers in the medical profession, not only doctors actually, but the people the nurses, or even the people who are involved in like transportation. When I went into the hospital, there's one person who's in charge of moving you down this hall, and there's another person in charge of, when you get in the ambulance, they sit with you. There's another one in charge of moving you to that hall, and you don't realize that you are until you fall into that, you don't realize that how much you need that whole system to function to get you out. So tremendous respect for all of the healers, the massage therapists, I tried all different things. So for all of those people who literally save and change lives, tremendous gratitude. I think there are issues related to women's pain and suffering that I think need to be addressed. I think the procedure that I underwent should not have been done without anesthesia. And it's never done with anesthesia. I mean, it's not done that way. But it should have been. And there are issues related to women's pain being taken seriously. And part of what happens is that imaging, when doctors see pictures and the images look good, then they think, oh, there's no problem here. But imaging doesn't reveal the muscles. It doesn't reveal, there's a great deal that imaging does not reveal. And one of the things that I learned is about the confluence of Eastern and Western medicine, in some ways needing both. And yet in my experience, often Western medicine seemed like a shorter way that was longer. There's a story in the Talmud of someone who is walking along the road and asks for directions into town. And this kid tells you, well, there's a short way that's long and a long way that's short. And he goes the way that seems to be shorter, but then he comes to this group of bushes and realizes he needs to go the long way because the short way is impacted. And so for me, that became a metaphor for Western and Eastern medicine, that Western medicine seemed like a shortcut, but actually ended up being longer and not as helpful for me. Whereas Eastern medicine was very, very slow. It was a long way. And yet it turned out more to be the route that I needed. Although I did do both. And so,
yes.
And combinations thereof. So I think that we need to avail ourselves of all healing modalities, and also that the challenge with Western medicine is that they'll often look at one part. There's someone in charge of the bladder. There's someone in charge of, and yet these parts work together. And so if it's looking at the whole picture, there's a danger of over specialization. And in my case, at least, there was a number of different parts that needed to be looked at. I think that Eastern and Western medicine have a great deal to teach one another, and that we need to get them to start talking to each other more.
But for sure. We are almost out of time, but someone is asking if you can share the name of the program in Northern California that helped you.
Yeah. Dr. David Weiss is the doctor in Northern California. His famous book is called The Headache in the Pelvis. And his website is Pelvic Pain Help. So that was a big turning point for me, not the only one, but a major source of healing.
Great.
And I'm very grateful to him.
Yeah, and it seems like perhaps maybe that will be helpful. So we really have 1 minute. Do you think that your pain, thankfully, was not short enough, but was finite? Do you think that this book would also be helpful for people who are dealing with chronic pain syndromes and long cases of that?
I do. It also features conversations that I had with people who were having, pelvic pain and other types of chronic pain for longer periods of time. I mean, I had it for 2.5 years, but it does have conversations with people who had it for many years more than that, or are dealing with it for a lifetime. So I do think it can be helpful, and I have tremendous reverence and awe for those who continue to struggle with this. For years and years, there's a incredible determination that it takes to grapple with this for a lifetime.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, and hopefully, you, you know, whether people are reading this book for to help with their own experiences of any kind of pain or chronic pain or whatnot, or if they are simply trying to understand other people around them who might be experiencing that, hopefully they will all find different keys, perhaps, but to help unlock the blocked passageways between an individual and community, people with each other. And so thank you again for this really rich conversation and for your courage and willingness to be vulnerable and share what you have in this conversation and in your book. I think we're all the better for it. Again, the book is called What Pain Teaches Us, Jewish Lessons on Healing. Thank you to all of those of you who joined us. If you enjoyed today's program and you would like to support more learning opportunities like this, we encourage you to do two things. First of all, if you haven't read this book, there's a link in the chat and you can purchase the book. But if you want to support more learning opportunities like this, we encourage you to make a donation. There is a link in the chat as well for those of you who would like to contribute, and your support helps us to continue bringing meaningful conversations to our community. Also, be sure to check out our upcoming programs on open.aju.edu, including a 4-part class on the rabbinic roots of the Passover Seder with my colleague here at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, Rabbi Gail Leibovitz, and a book talk with Anthony Julius on Abraham, the First Jew. We'll see you next time on AJU Open. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.